Friday, September 25th, 2020, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today we're going to look at the central bankers and especially the BIS and why gold price manipulation is the least of their misdeeds. We're going to look at the shady past of the Bank for International Settlements. I always reference this book. You need to try to get this book if you really want to know what's going on in the world, in my opinion. It's not just about banking. It's about power, politics, about war. I've done about 20 videos about the BIS, so I've built up a playlist that you can go to now, and it's called the BIS, the Central Bankers Secret Club. So I've got 20 videos, including live streams, hours of videos and information about the BIS. But today I'm going to talk about how the BIS actually financed both sides of World War II and how scandalous it was, but it still stayed alive as a bank, even though there were some countries like Norway who wanted the bank liquidated after World War II. And you'd be surprised which bank and which country actually wanted to keep the BIS alive. And of course, there's been a lot of information, a lot of articles written about the fact that the BIS, which is the central bankers' bank, of course, does a lot of trading for the central banks. And why do they do that? Well, because they can keep it hidden. Even though the BIS is based in Basel, Switzerland, it is a supranational institution. It operates like the Vatican. It operates like the City of London or Washington, D.C., even though it's in Switzerland. And Zero Hedge has got quite a few articles talking about this. There's one going as far back as 2012. It says BIS FX Gold Intervention Profiles Before and After. There's one from 2020, more recently, a Bullion Start Perspective video, Chris Powell, Central Bank Gold Manipulation. There's a story here, article from February this year, gold suddenly hammered by multi-billion-dollar sale. And it says it looks like our good friend Benoit Gilson over at the BIS just got the nod. And you can search on Google BIS gold manipulation zero hedge. You need to put zero hedge because Google, even though these articles by zero hedge were very popular, it doesn't show up anymore. So you need to write zero hedge on it. And they talk about how years ago, a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little less, the BIS and other central banks got a special discount to deal on comex or the CME to deal in futures. So why would the BIS want to deal in futures, right? The BIS is supposed to be the bank that helps also regulate the too big to fail banks. It's supposed to be under its Financial Stability Board. It's supposed to be a global regulator to promote how can I say, stable banking, but they're dealing in futures and options on the CME. Could it be that they're dealing for their parents, like at Threadneedle Street or at Liberty Street for the New York Fed, for the Bank of England? I would say so. But as I said, it's not their biggest misdeed. For me, it is the fact that they financed both sides of World War II. So let's quickly look at some passages in this book, The Tower of Basel by Adam Libor, where he goes on about this. Because if you tell people this, they don't believe you. And that's why it's easier for us who know this to understand why the current crisis is most probably engineered. This is on page 83, Hitler's American Banker. So it's talking about a guy called McKittrick, who was an American who was the president of the BIS during World War II. He worked for an English investment bank prior to going to the BIS. Apparently, it was one of the biggest, most famous investment banks of the day. It was like the Goldman Sachs of the day. So this is what Adam Libor says in his book. McKittrick's prediction proved correct, but America's entrance into the war in December 1941 caused him further problems. The BIS president was no longer a neutral, but a citizen of a belligerent nation in daily contact with his German, French, and Italian colleagues. So this is quite amazing that the German, French, and Italian central bankers were still cooperating during World War II. But the advent of hostilities between the United States and Nazi Germany did not change his cordial and productive relationship with the Reichsbank. Poole, I think he was the German representative, wrote of McKittrick's in September 1942, and I quote, Poole, P-U-H-L. Neither his personality or his manner of conducting business have been any cause for any criticism whatsoever. Poole even described the BIS as the only real foreign branch of the Reichsbank. Some of the BIS's dividend payments to its shareholders in Nazi-occupied countries went through the Reichsbank, thus giving Berlin access to the foreign exchange transactions and allowing it to charge a fee for its services. During the war, the Reichsbank continued to pay interest on BIS investments in Germany, even though that interest contributed to the bank's dividends, which were paid to its shareholders, including the Bank of England. Thus, through the BIS, Nazi Germany was contributing to Britain's wartime economy. So it makes you wonder if the English wanted to really avoid World War II, they could have just closed down the BIS and stopped the Germans financing their war effort. It makes you wonder why people like Captain Ramsey, who was an MP in the UK during World War II, was put in prison for 4 years for criticizing the entrance of this country into the war. He wrote this book that I recommend, The Nameless War. It's a very controversial book. Here's another interesting part about how the big Wall Street banks, the central banks, were all involved in this. And it goes back to McKittrick. It says, once again, the German chemical industries were key. In 1925, Lee Higginson, McKittrick's employers, so that's that London bank, had been part of a syndicate including Enskilda Bank, that's SEK in Sweden, that's the Wallenbergs, that had issued an £8 million bond on behalf of the German potash syndicate. 19 years later, McKittrick was still ensuring that supplies of the mineral vital for agriculture would continue after the war's end. A second paragraph, also dateline Basel, outlines how even as Allied airmen were bombing Germany, McKittrick had already concluded an agreement to preserve the industrial substance of the Reich. Anyone who questioned the wisdom of such backdoor accords was merely a leftist radical. And this is what it goes on to say here about McKittrick. Mr. Thomas H. McKittrick, the American president of the BIS, had announced his decision to continue his efforts for a close cooperation between the Allied and German business world, irrespective of the opposition of certain leftist radical groups. In these efforts, he counts on the full assistance of the American State Department. After the war, such agreements will be invaluable, said McKittrick. How can you be a leftist radical if you want to stop financing the enemy? I mean, that's a really bad excuse in my book. We learned that certain German interests had received assurances that their negative attitude toward the National Socialist regime will be fully considered by the Allied political and economic leadership after the war. Negotiations are underway to bring hostilities to a speedy conclusion and to preserve the industrial substance of the Reich. So this is another interesting part here about McKittrick. It says, meanwhile, Thomas McKittrick had a lucrative new job. Soon after he stepped down as BIS president in 1946, he was appointed a vice president of Chase National Bank in New York. That's the Rockefeller Bank, in charge of foreign loans. McKittrick was even lauded by those whose stolen goods he had purveyed. He was invited to Brussels and decorated with the Royal Order of the Crown of Belgium. The honor, noted a press release, was in recognition of his friendly attitude to Belgium and his services as president of the Bank for International Settlements during World War II. I'm not trying to downplay the graveness and importance of the manipulation of the gold price. And why is that important? Well, because it keeps this fraudulent fiat currency system going. It keeps the public indebted. It keeps the public, liable to all the national debt that these governments and central bankers are creating on their backs. But I would say it's even more important that we delve into the history of the central banks and especially the BIS, which is basically a tool of the central bankers to do their dirty work, be it financing wars, be it financing gold price manipulation, and other things. And yes, they're protected by international law. It's amazing because actually you have to give the American administration credit, because towards the end of World War II, once the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed in 1944, Henry Dexter White and the American delegation, they wanted to liquidate this bank. They knew what this bank did, especially Morgenthau, who I think he was the Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt. They wanted to liquidate this bank. They wanted to close it down. They knew how this bank was involved, how this bank actually allowed the warring factions, the Allies and the Axis, to finance each other. While the general public thought they were in an existential war, the bankers were making money and financing this. It could have very easily been shut down, this bank, during World War II. But John Maynard Keynes, who was the head of the British delegation at Bretton Woods, through the Bank of England, they were very much against closing this bank down. So is it any wonder that I have very little respect for the Bank of England and even for the Federal Reserve now, even though they weren't directly involved in this? But they shouldn't be a member of the BIS. They should be getting out of the BIS. I think Randall Quarles, who is the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, he's now the head of the Financial Stability Board at the BIS. Should he really be involved with these people? I don't think so. So I think that's much more serious than the gold price manipulation. This bank, BIS, needs to be exposed. I highly recommend you go through my playlist, which I've put up in the cards and below in the description. So now with that, let's quickly look at where the markets are. It's 8:32 a.m. London time. We saw a nice rebound yesterday in the precious metals. Yes, they were hit really hard. I think gold got down to a low of around 1848. Silver got down to around 2160. But right now, as I speak here, gold is up another $7 at 1874. The high has been 1875 and the low 1861. Silver is at 23.20. It's up about 6 cents. So it did outperform gold yesterday. Silver right now, it's kind of matching gold. We want to see it outperform, of course. We saw the stock market inch up a little bit yesterday. not much to write home about. Right now, we've got the Dow future up about 108, the S&P up about 10, and the NASDAQ 100 future up about 30. The currencies, they are rebounding a little bit, especially the pound, which has been hit quite hard recently. It's up 0.33% at 127.91. The euro is up 0.1% at 116.81, and the dollar is unchanged versus the yen at 105.33. WTI crude oil is up 0.4% at 40.50. So oil remains quite strong, which is unusual because recently, in the last year or so, when we've seen the stock market drop sharply as it has recently, we've seen oil follow the stock market. But now it seems like oil is holding on. This could be a sign that investors are starting to feel that commodities could be going up, even though we're seeing the stock markets going down. I think that's an interesting relationship to keep an eye on right now. The 10-year yield is still very stable, so we are at 0.67%. So the bond markets have become kind of moribund at the moment, going nowhere. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and these other platforms below here. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye.